You've probably heard me talk about non-buyer surveys quite a lot recently because I love them. Because if you are having trouble converting leads into customers and clients, your non-buyer survey is going to help you root out like why. Recently though, a few people have asked me, well, how do you find the non-buyers? Like where do you reach out to them and how do you do that, right? And so the first thing you have to realize is what a non-buyer is. So I determine a non-buyer as someone who's had exposure to your offer and they said no, right? Even better, they've had exposure and shown interest and then said no. So that's, for me, that's what makes a non-buyer. So if you think in the context of launching, for example, and people who have received your launch emails, and not only received, but like at least opened some of them or clicked through to the sales page, that would be a non-buyer. Or it's just as true for like an evergreen sales sequence. Someone who's received the sales emails and then clicked on the email or opened the email and then clicked over to the sales page, that would be a non-buyer in my book. So that's your best person to ask, right? Because they've shown interest in what you're offering, but then they've passed. So their insights are going to be the most valuable. The second thing you need to have to run a non-buyer survey to these people is a pathway of communication, right? So an email list. That is by far the most useful, easiest way to reach out to non-buyers and to identify who non-buyers are because you've sent them emails, right? Promotional emails or sales emails, launch emails. So 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 times out of 10, when I run non-buyer surveys, we are reaching out to an email list. So this is your sign that if you don't have an email list, you should start building one because that's going to give you a direct path to the people you want to reach, both in terms of promoting your products and services, but also reaching out to non-buyers to figure out why more people aren't buying them. Also in the past, I have used like the newsletter list as a way to find non-buyers. So we ran a lead discovery survey. As part of that survey, I added in some segmenting questions, right? So yes, no questions to find out which of the subscribers had actually heard or seen the offer on the website. And so if they answered yes to that question, then they were sort of funneled into the non-buyer questions, right? Because they had been exposed to the offer. If they answered no, then they had not been exposed to the offer. So their perspective wasn't relevant to the non-buyer survey. So we just ended that survey, right? So if they answered no, they didn't continue. But if they answered yes, that helped us figure out who on the newsletter list had seen the offer on the website. That was kind of a creative approach because the client I was working with did not have any sales sequences or promotions set up. And so we weren't able to track who had seen the offer because we didn't have those emails. So those are the approaches that I've used in the past. Another approach you might take would be to reach out to people individually. Say if you sell like one-to-one, right? So if you do sales calls, then this will be something that you could consider, is reaching out to people who had booked sales calls or consult calls, whatever you call them, and then decided not to move forward. So you can reach out to those people one-to-one and ask them to answer a few questions or fill out your survey or talk to you even. I've personally just not used that approach because we always have an email list to work with, and most of the time I'm working with people who sell one-to-many and not one-to-one. So you could get creative if you can't use any of those methods and reach out, say, to social media followers. If you have a pretty engaged following, you can use a similar approach to where you set up your survey to segment out people who haven't heard of the offer or haven't seen the offer because their perspective isn't relevant to this purpose. And then the people who have then can go on into the non-buyer survey. So that's a potential solution. I haven't used it, but it could work. And then if you only really have like organic traffic or people just landing on the website to rely on, then you would consider maybe an exit intent pop-up. My experience with exit intent pop-ups for people who are basically strangers who don't really know you or have any connection to your brand is that responses tend to be very, very low. So I wouldn't expect a lot of responses if you try to use the exit intent pop-up method. However, if you have nothing else to work with, you might as well give it a try and see what you collect, because having some data is better than having no data at all. But just keep in mind, the best pathway to non-buyers is through your email list.